Moscow, August 23rd, 1939. Rain fell like ash, heavy, endless, soaking the cobblestones outside the Kremlin. Inside, beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Grand Hall, a long oak table gleamed beneath harsh electric light. Around it sat men who would carve up the world. Joseph Stalin leaned back in his chair, cigarette smoke curling from his fingers. His mustache twitched as he smiled. That slow, deliberate smile that always meant he'd already decided something. Across from him sat the Germans. Ribbentrop, precise, elegant, a man who smiled without warmth. Behind him a stack of documents thick enough to change history. No one spoke for a long time. The ticking of the clock echoed like footsteps approaching an execution. Finally, Stalin broke the silence. "So," he said in Russian, voice low, "you propose a friendship treaty?" Ribbentrop adjusted his cuffs. "A non-aggression pact, Marshal Stalin, between Germany and the Soviet Union. Mutual respect of borders. Peace in our time." Peace. The word hung in the air like a bad joke. Molotov, Stalin's foreign minister, exchanged a glance with his boss. "And Poland?" he asked softly. Ribbentrop didn't hesitate. "Poland," he said, "will cease to exist as it currently does." He unfolded a map. Europe, flat and clean, lines drawn by hands that had never bled. A thick pencil stroke cut down the center of Poland, splitting it like an apple. Germany would take the west. The Soviet Union would take the east. Stalin's eyes narrowed. "You wish us to share a border?" Ribbentrop nodded. "A new border, one no one can challenge." The rain hammered harder on the windows. Somewhere outside, thunder rolled. The kind of thunder that sounds like distant artillery. Stalin stubbed out his cigarette. "And the Baltic states?" "Yours," Ribbentrop said. He leaned forward. "In exchange, you will stand aside when Germany resolves its Polish question." Molotov translated the phrase with a grim smile. "Resolves," he said, "means invades." Ribbentrop shrugged. "Call it what you like." For a long moment, Stalin said nothing. Then he reached for the pen. "History," he murmured, "is written by those who sign first." He signed. Then Molotov, then Ribbentrop. The ink bled slightly on the parchment, black lines spreading like veins. In Berlin, champagne corks would soon pop. In Warsaw, soldiers would still be polishing their boots. And in Moscow, under the echo of thunder, two dictators who hated each other more than anyone else on earth shook hands and agreed to divide it. As the German plane lifted off from Moscow that night, carrying Ribbentrop and the secret protocol back to Berlin, Stalin turned to Molotov and said quietly, "They think they've fooled us, but in time, comrade, we will be the ones standing on their ashes." Molotov didn't answer. He only looked down at the map, at that dark line running through the heart of Poland, and wondered how long the ink would take to turn into blood. Berlin, August 24th, 1939. The ink on the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact hadn't yet dried when the news hit Hitler's desk. He stood by the window of the Reich Chancellery, watching the city below. Flags with black swastikas flapped in the wind, and the street outside was a sea of uniforms. Berlin looked like it was already celebrating a war that hadn't begun. Ribbentrop's plane had just landed at Tempelhof. The report was brief and chillingly efficient. Stalin had agreed. The Soviets would stay quiet while Germany marched into Poland. For the first time in years, Hitler's war machine had no threat at its back. He turned to Keitel and Goering, his eyes fever bright. "The Russians will not interfere," he said. "The East is secured. We have freedom. Freedom to act." Freedom meant destruction. Goering laughed, lighting a cigar. "It's like 1914, but this time we'll finish it." Keitel looked less certain. "Mein Führer, and if the British respond?" Hitler waved a hand. "They will protest, of course, but they will not fight for Poland. They didn't fight for Austria. They didn't fight for Czechoslovakia. They talk, they write letters, and then they sleep." He walked back to his desk, unrolling a map. Poland stretched out like a promise. We strike at dawn, September 1st. Poland will collapse in 3 weeks. He tapped the line dividing the country in half. The Soviets will come from the other side. The Poles will be crushed between us like grain between millstones. Keitel saluted. Yes, mein Führer. That night, in the radio room of the German High Command, code clerks transmitted new orders under cipher. Fall Weiss, Operation White, to commence on schedule. In the corridors, generals shook hands quietly. Soldiers packed ammunition, loaded tanks, wrote hurried letters home. And somewhere in the middle of it all, one young officer stared at the bulletin board where the orders were pinned. He was 24, a communications lieutenant named Hans Adler. He read the destination, Poland. He'd fought in Czechoslovakia the year before, a campaign without resistance, without guilt. But this time felt different. He turned to the officer beside him. You think the Russians will really stay out? The man smirked. They signed the pact, didn't they? Hans looked down at the paper again. So did the devil once. Warsaw, that same night. The Polish General Staff had received whispers, rumors from diplomats in London and Paris, a secret agreement between Berlin and Moscow, but there was no proof. Marshal Rydz-Śmigły stood before a wall map crowded with red pins. If Germany invades, we hold the line. We've faced worse. An officer spoke up quietly. And the Soviets, sir? Rydz's voice hardened. The Soviets are our enemies, but not our immediate problem. He turned to the room. Mobilization continues. No matter what happens, we fight. Outside, in the streets of Warsaw, people stood in lines at bakeries, theaters, tram stops, trying to live as if the world weren't about to collapse. Somewhere above them, in the night sky, the faint drone of German reconnaissance planes was already audible. The war had not begun, but it was already here. In Moscow, Stalin's aides brought him updates every hour. The ink from the signatures had barely dried, but troop movements were already underway. Soviet divisions were ordered to prepare for border security operations. Molotov entered the office carrying a folder marked Confidential. Stalin didn't look up. Well? The Germans are moving, Molotov said. They will strike within days. Stalin lit another cigarette. Good. Let them. We'll watch. When Poland falls, we'll move in. No one will stop us. Molotov hesitated. And the West? They'll shout, Stalin said, and then they'll die. He smiled faintly, smoke curling from his lips. Europe is a corpse waiting for someone to bury it. Let Hitler dig the grave. We'll take the shovel. Outside the Kremlin, the rain finally stopped. But in the east and west, on two sides of the same doomed country, two armies, two ideologies, were already massing behind invisible borders. And in the quiet, before the storm, Poland slept beneath a sky that was about to split in half. The first light of September 1st, 1939, never reached Poland. The dawn was drowned out by fire. At 4:45 a.m., the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein, anchored in the harbor of Danzig, opened fire on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte. The first shell hit the barracks. The second struck the guardhouse. Within minutes, smoke swallowed the peninsula. Across the border, German tanks roared to life, 1.5 million men moving like one machine. They came through forests, over rivers, across fields that still smelled of harvest. They came with precision, radio-linked, coordinated, unstoppable. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, had begun. In Warsaw, sirens wailed. Children clutched their mothers. Tramcars screeched to a halt. The air raid warnings that had sounded so often as drills now carried the tone of prophecy. Marshal Rydz-Śmigły received the first reports by 5:15 a.m. German forces advancing along all fronts, an officer said, voice trembling. Airfields destroyed, rail lines cut. They've hit Krakow, Łódź, Poznan. Rydz slammed his fist on the table. Tell the pilots, take off. Whatever's left, get it in the air. But most Polish aircraft were already gone, caught in hangars before they could even move. By noon, the German advance had broken through 3 defensive lines, roads clogged with refugees and retreating soldiers. In the east, Soviet radio stations remained eerily silent. No condemnation, no response, just silence. That silence was worth half a continent. Berlin, same morning. Hitler stood before a sea of officers in the Reichstag, his voice booming through loudspeakers across Europe. "This morning, German troops crossed into Poland," he declared. "We are responding to Polish aggression on our border." A lie so big, it almost sounded like truth. Crowds cheered in the streets. Newspapers printed the word victory before the battle was even over. In the radio room, Lieutenant Hans Adler, the young officer from before, stared at the glowing transmitters, listening to the war he had helped unleash. Static, screams, reports from the front. He heard a field commander shouting over gunfire, "Resistance heavier than expected, Poles fighting like devils." Hans turned off the set and sat back, his stomach twisting. He'd been taught that Poland would crumble in 3 days, but in the first hours it already bled slower than anyone had planned. Moscow, September 2nd. Stalin paced his office, a newspaper folded in his hand. The headline, "Germany invades Poland." He smiled faintly. Molotov entered. "The West has declared war," he said. "Britain and France, both." Stalin stopped. "Declared," he repeated, "but not acted." He tossed the paper aside. "Good. Let them tire each other out." Molotov hesitated. "Hitler will expect us to move soon." Stalin poured a glass of vodka, his voice calm. "And we will. But not yet. Let him do the heavy lifting. When Poland is gasping for breath, then we arrive as liberators." He raised his glass. "To liberation." Molotov lifted his own, though his eyes betrayed unease. "And to division." They drank. By September 7th, Warsaw was under siege. The city shook day and night from the bombing. Bridges collapsed into the Vistula. Hospitals overflowed with wounded. Still, the defenders refused to surrender. A reporter for the Daily Telegraph, trapped in the city, wrote, "Every bomb seems to miss its target, but no one believes the next one will." Civilians dug trenches with their hands. Priests carried stretchers. Even the orchestra from the National Theatre played in the streets, trying to drown out the sound of planes. But everyone knew. The storm from the west was unstoppable, and the one from the east hadn't even begun. On the night of September 16th, a Polish sentry on the eastern frontier saw movement through the fog. Headlights, engines, hundreds of them. Not German gray, not Polish khaki, olive green, red stars painted on steel. He blinked, unsure. Then the radio crackled from headquarters, a single message that froze the world in place. The Soviets have crossed the border. 2 weeks after the pact was signed, the trap had closed. September 17th, 1939. The eastern sky glowed red, not from sunrise, but from the fire of advancing tanks. The Soviet Union had entered Poland. Officially, they called it a mission to protect the people of western Ukraine and Belarus. In truth, it was an invasion wearing a diplomatic mask. Polish border guards awoke to the sound of engines, shouting, and the dull thunder of artillery. They expected Germans. Instead, they saw red stars. Confusion spread faster than the tanks themselves. Some units held fire, believing at first it was a mistake, that maybe the Soviets were here to help push back Germany. But the illusion didn't last long. The first shots from Soviet guns ended that question forever. In Warsaw, Marshal Rides Śmigły received the message in disbelief. His adjutant repeated it twice, as if the words themselves refused to make sense. Soviet forces have entered from the east. Multiple crossings. Białystok, Lwów, Wilno. Rids slammed his palm on the table. "We're surrounded!" His staff stared at the map. Arrows from the west, arrows from the east, converging like jaws around the heart of Poland. Someone whispered, "What are our orders?" Rids took a breath that sounded like defeat. "Do not fight the Soviets unless they attack first. Save your strength for the Germans. Get to the south, to Romania." He paused, eyes hollow. "Save what can be saved." That was the closest thing to surrender Poland would ever issue. On the eastern plains, Soviet troops advanced methodically, Columns stretching for miles, red banners flapping against the wind. At their head rode General Kombrig Vasily Chuikov, his face expressionless, his orders clear: occupy, disarm, and control. His driver, a young sergeant from Minsk, asked quietly, "Comrade General, what if the Poles resist?" Chuikov didn't look up. "Then they will cease to exist." They passed villages where peasants watched in silence, clutching icons, unsure whether to cheer or hide. Soviet soldiers handed out leaflets written in Polish and Ukrainian. "Do not resist. The Red Army comes to free you from fascism." Freedom, it seemed, arrived on tank treads. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Ribbentrop received the message that the Soviets had crossed the border. He reported to Hitler immediately. "The eastern half is theirs as agreed," he said. Hitler nodded, smiling faintly. "Good. Stalin keeps his word. For now." He turned to his generals. "We move faster. The Soviets will want their share. We'll make sure ours is larger." The two dictators, hundreds of miles apart, were working together without a single word of trust between them. It was a marriage of monsters, each already planning the other's funeral. Moscow celebrated in silence. No speeches, no parades. Just a quiet satisfaction that half of Poland was now Soviet. Stalin sat with Molotov in his office, sipping tea. "Germany's done well," Molotov said. "They've crushed the West." Stalin smiled. "Good. They'll bleed themselves dry in Europe while we take everything else." He looked up at the map. "Now we control the border we wanted. Now we move the people." "Which people, comrade?" Molotov asked, though he already knew. "All of them," Stalin replied. "Anyone who remembers Poland as a nation." Within weeks, Soviet security forces, the NKVD, began arrests: teachers, officers, priests, anyone with a title, a book, or a memory of freedom. Trainloads of prisoners were sent east to Siberia. No one came back. In the small city of Lwów, Captain Janek Nowak, a Polish officer who had fought the Germans for 2 weeks straight, now faced a new enemy. His unit was cornered between two advancing armies. One of his men asked, "Sir, who do we shoot at?" Janek looked at the map spread on the hood of a truck. "Everyone," he said. Then, softer, "No one. It doesn't matter anymore." That night, they buried their weapons in the forest and crossed the border into Romania, uniforms torn, spirits broken. Behind them, the Polish eagle, the symbol of their country, vanished into smoke. In the Kremlin, Stalin picked up the phone and called Berlin. It was the first direct call between the two powers since the invasion began. Ribbentrop answered. Stalin's tone was calm, almost pleasant. "Congratulations, Herr Ribbentrop," he said. "Poland is no more." He paused, smiling into the silence. "Now," he added, "let us discuss the border." The devil wanted precision. In the Kremlin, Stalin picked up the phone and called Berlin. It was the first direct call between the two powers since the invasion began. Ribbentrop answered. Stalin's tone was calm, almost pleasant. "Congratulations, Herr Ribbentrop," he said. "Poland is no more." He paused, smiling into the silence. "Now," he added, "let us discuss the border." The devil wanted precision. September 25th, 1939. The meeting room in the Kremlin was windowless, the air thick with smoke and suspicion. Maps of Eastern Europe lay spread across the table, the new Europe, not yet announced to the world. Stalin's pipe glowed faintly as he spoke. "The Germans have taken Warsaw. Our troops are in Lwów. The border must now be drawn clearly." Across from him sat the German delegation. Ribbentrop again, pale and precise, a man who looked like he'd already lived this moment in his head. A Soviet officer unrolled a massive chart of Poland, its railways and rivers marked in red. Stalin stood, tracing the Narew and the Bug rivers with one thick finger. "Here," he said, "will be the new frontier. The Soviet Union will take Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Eastern Poland. You will take the rest." Ribbentrop nodded. "As agreed." But Stalin wasn't finished. He pointed at Vilnius, the old Lithuanian capital. "This," he said, "we will give to Lithuania later, when it joins our union, a gesture of goodwill. Ribbentrop hesitated. "And what of the people, Marshal?" Stalin smiled without humor. "People are not borders, Herr Ribbentrop. They are resources. You will manage yours, and we will manage ours." Molotov handed over the revised protocol. The ink was barely dry from the last pact, but history demanded another. They signed again. And with each stroke of the pen, millions of lives vanished into legal phrasing, zones of interest, territorial adjustment, mutual understanding. The map of Europe was redrawn not with armies, but with pencils. In Warsaw, the fires still burned. The city had surrendered on September 27th, its streets reduced to rubble, its defenders starving after weeks without food or sleep. German soldiers marched through the ruins, taking photographs as if visiting a museum. In one basement, a family huddled together around a single candle. The father whispered, "It's over now. They've stopped fighting." His wife shook her head. "Wars don't stop. They just move." Outside, the boots of two occupiers already echoed on opposite sides of the same street. In Berlin, Hitler received Ribbentrop's report with satisfaction. "Good," he said. "The East is stable. Now we face West." He turned to his generals. "England and France are next. The Poles are finished." Goebbels recorded the moment in his diary. "Poland no longer exists. The Führer is jubilant. Europe will soon be cleansed of weakness." The propaganda machine went to work immediately. Posters, films, radio broadcasts proclaiming victory and friendship between the Reich and the Soviet Union. German newspapers printed smiling photographs of Ribbentrop and Molotov shaking hands. None showed the barbed wire, the mass graves, or the trains moving east under night skies. In Moscow, Soviet newspapers mirrored the lie. Headlines called the invasion a liberation of oppressed Ukrainians and Belarusians. Parades were held in Minsk and Lwów, red flags replacing white eagles overnight. But in the cellars of the NKVD, the real work began. Polish officers, officials, and intellectuals were rounded up. Tens of thousands taken to camps in the forests. Their names would later fill lists that would end in places like Katyn. Molotov watched the reports pile up on his desk. He turned to Stalin. "The Germans are efficient." Stalin puffed his pipe. "So are we." In Paris, meanwhile, diplomats debated what to call the war, now that Poland had vanished. The French called it la drôle de guerre, the phony war. But in Warsaw, in Lwów, in the fields of the East, there was nothing phony about it. A courier from the Polish underground crossed into Romania that night, carrying a single coded message for the exiled government. "The country is gone, but the nation is not. We will continue." Back in Moscow, Stalin stood once more before the great map, half Europe shaded in red. He tapped his pipe against the table. "For now," he said, "the Germans are our friends." He smiled thinly, his eyes cold. "But friendship," he added, "is a useful disguise." Outside, snow began to fall, the first hint of the winter that would one day bury empires. October 1939. Europe held its breath, not in peace, but in paralysis. The maps were redrawn, the speeches given, the photographs taken, and yet somewhere beneath the official silence, the ground itself seemed to hum with unease. Two empires now stood shoulder to shoulder, pretending to be partners, already preparing to betray. In Moscow, Stalin reviewed the reports from the NKVD. The pacification of eastern Poland was underway. Thousands of Polish officers had been identified, rounded up, and sent east for interrogation. The files were thin, name, rank, last known address, but the list was endless. Lavrenti Beria, the head of the NKVD, stood stiffly across the desk. "Resistance is broken," he said. "The Polish army is finished." Stalin nodded. "Good. And the civilians?" Beria smiled faintly. "Also finished." In occupied Warsaw, the city was a wound. The streets stank of smoke and brick dust. The air hung heavy with curfews and whispers. German posters covered every wall. Verboten, Arbeitspflicht, Todesstrafe für Sabotage, forbidden, labor duty, Death for sabotage. A young teacher named Zofia walked past the ruins of her school, her coat buttoned to her chin. She carried no books now, only scraps of paper folded in her pocket. On them were the first coded messages of the Polish underground. The ink was faint, the handwriting hurried, but it was the beginning of something enormous. The state was gone. The nation had gone underground. At the same hour, in the eastern half of Poland, Soviet soldiers replaced German patrols. The transition was seamless. The same checkpoints, the same fear, different language. A peasant in Lwów whispered to his neighbor, "The Germans burned the churches. The Russians will burn the priests." He was right on both counts. In a small wooden house outside Grodno, a Polish captain sat at his kitchen table, his uniform folded neatly beside him. His wife poured him tea. "What will you do now?" she asked. He looked out the window at the red star on the passing tanks. "What I've always done," he said softly. "Wait for someone to remember us." Berlin, October 5th. Hitler and Ribbentrop met again to celebrate. The Reich Chancellery gleamed like a stage. Marble floors, chandeliers, endless applause. "Europe is divided," Ribbentrop said proudly. "The British and French sit behind their lines. They will not move." Hitler smiled, eyes half mad with triumph. "Then we move west. The Poles were the rehearsal. France will be the play." But even as he spoke, reports came in from the east, Soviet agents taking control of cities, conscripting men, nationalizing property. The Führer's smile faded for a moment. Stalin wastes no time. Ribbentrop bowed slightly. Neither should we. In the Baltic states, Soviet diplomats arrived carrying friendship treaties. Within weeks, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania signed under pressure. By November, Soviet troops occupied their ports for defense. The red tide had begun to rise quietly, efficiently, under the guise of peace. In the Kremlin, Stalin read the dispatches with satisfaction. He turned to Molotov. "You see, Vyacheslav, this is how you conquer without firing a shot." Molotov smiled. "Until the shots are needed." Stalin's eyes glinted. And they always are. In the West, the war went strangely still. British soldiers sat in trenches along the French border, drinking tea and waiting for an enemy who didn't come. Newspapers called it the phony war. But in Poland, there was nothing phony about it. The graves were real, the silence was real, and the pact that had made it all possible was realest of all. In late November, a single telegram crossed Stalin's desk from Berlin. It read, "Comrade Stalin, our friendship is unbreakable. Our spheres are secure. Europe belongs to us." Stalin read it twice, then scribbled a note in the margin with his pencil. "Until it doesn't." He smiled faintly. "Friendship," he muttered, "is only temporary between wolves." And somewhere in the snow outside Moscow, the first winter winds began to whisper, the kind of wind that carries the sound of approaching betrayal. November 30th, 1939. The illusion of peace shattered at dawn. From the forests near Lake Ladoga, the Red Army poured across the Finnish border. Artillery thundered, shells whistled through the air, and snow erupted in geysers of fire. The winter war had begun. Stalin's defensive expansion had found its next target, Finland, a small nation with forests instead of fortresses, and a population that refused to kneel. The Soviet press called it a limited operation to secure Leningrad's borders. But the soldiers who crossed the frontier knew better. They were there to erase another country from the map, just as they'd done to Poland. In the Kremlin, Molotov assured foreign diplomats that the invasion was a peaceful measure. When reporters asked why Soviet bombers had hit Helsinki that morning, he replied coldly, "The Soviet Air Force has not bombed Finnish cities. We merely dropped humanitarian aid." The world laughed, bitterly, but did nothing. France and Britain issued protests. The League of Nations expelled the USSR, but the Red Army kept advancing, confident that numbers would drown resistance. They were wrong. In the forests outside Suomussalmi, temperatures dropped to 40 degrees. Finnish ski troops, clad in white, silent as ghosts, struck Soviet columns in the night. Grenades fell like whispers. Machine guns rattled. Then they vanished back into the trees. A young Soviet soldier wrote in his diary, "We don't see them until they shoot. The snow itself fights for Finland." By January, thousands of Soviet troops were frozen in the wilderness, their tanks immobilized by ice, their officers dead or gone. The world had expected Finland to fall in a week. It was still standing after 2 months. In Berlin, Hitler watched the news closely. He saw what Stalin's army could and couldn't do. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a plan began to form. In March 1940, after 105 brutal days, the war ended. Finland signed the Moscow Peace Treaty, forced to give up 11% of its territory. But it survived. Stalin called it victory. Privately, it was humiliation. Nearly 200,000 Soviet casualties for a few frozen forests. He stood before his generals, face unreadable. "We have learned valuable lessons," he said. Beria nodded. "The army must be restructured." Stalin's eyes narrowed. "And it will be. Next time there will be no mistakes." In Berlin, the lessons were noted too. Hitler, ever the opportunist, told his generals, "The Red Army bleeds easily. One good strike, and it will collapse." He began drafting the first outlines of Operation Barbarossa. The ink had barely dried on the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and already one partner was planning the other's death. Spring 1940 brought new shadows over Europe. The Germans invaded Denmark and Norway in April. By May, they rolled into France. By June, Paris had fallen. Hitler now ruled the West. Stalin ruled the East. And between them, the smoldering ruins of Poland marked their handshake, the scar where Europe had been split open. Rehook. That summer, Ribbentrop returned to Moscow with another message. Germany now controlled nearly all of Western Europe. He told Stalin, "The Führer sends his regards and a proposal. Let us divide the world as we divided Poland." Stalin smiled slowly. "The world," he said, "is very large." But behind the smile, something tightened, a flicker of instinct. He'd seen how Hitler looked at maps, and he knew the next line to be drawn might not stop at Poland. It might run straight through Moscow. November 1940. The world map lay sprawled before Stalin like a chessboard, pieces already in motion, kings waiting to be toppled. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had lasted 15 months. On paper, Germany and the Soviet Union were still friends. But the friendship now creaked under its own weight. Hitler ruled Europe. Stalin ruled silence. And both men were beginning to listen too closely to the sound of their own victories. In Berlin, Ribbentrop's return from Moscow was hailed as a diplomatic triumph. He had met Stalin in person, toasted vodka, and discussed future spheres of influence. But behind the photographs, the tension was palpable. Stalin wanted the Balkans. Hitler wanted them too. When Molotov requested that the Soviet Union be given free access to the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, Hitler's smile vanished. The Führer's mind was already fixed elsewhere, on the east, on Lebensraum, on the vast plains that stretched to the Urals. He ended the meeting politely, but the decision had already been made. Moscow, that same week. Molotov returned furious. His train had been shadowed by Luftwaffe bombers during the journey back. It wasn't an accident. He stormed into Stalin's office, slamming his briefcase on the desk. "They think they can frighten us." Stalin didn't look up. He was reading the latest intelligence reports, German troops amassing near the Soviet frontier. He closed the folder calmly. "They are preparing for something," Molotov said. "Yes," Stalin murmured. "So are we." Winter 1940-41. The pact still held, but only on paper. Behind the border, the Wehrmacht trained in silence, drawing new invasion routes. Code name, Operation Barbarossa. The plan was staggering. 3 million men, 3,500 tanks, 7,000 aircraft, the largest invasion in human history. And it would begin the same way Poland had, suddenly, mercilessly, without warning. Meanwhile, Stalin moved cautiously. He strengthened Western defenses, but only enough to appear defensive, not paranoid. He sent shipments of oil, grain, and manganese to Germany, keeping the mask of friendship intact. The trains rolled west every night, each one filled with fuel that would one day burn Soviet cities. "Feed the wolf," Stalin told Beria. "Let him think we are tame." In Warsaw, now divided and occupied, life had turned into routine horror. In the German zone, Jews were forced into ghettos, sealed behind brick walls and barbed wire. In the Soviet zone, anyone with an education disappeared in the night. 2 Polands, one starving, one deported, both erased by the same pact. A smuggled note from a Polish officer interned by the Soviets reached London that winter. "They say we are safe here, but the forests are filling with graves." He signed it simply, Katyn, March 1940. No one in the West understood what the word meant yet. But soon they would. By spring 1941, tension crackled through the air like static. Trains full of German troops moved eastward under the cover of exercises. Soviet observers reported the buildup, but Stalin dismissed it. "Hitler won't attack while Britain stands," he insisted. "He is not mad enough to fight on 2 fronts." Molotov disagreed quietly. He was mad enough to invade Poland. Stalin didn't answer. He stared at the map on his wall, that black pencil line he'd drawn 2 years ago, the one dividing Poland. He traced it slowly with his finger. Then he whispered almost to himself, "Maybe the line was never between us and them. Maybe it was under our feet all along." June was approaching. The wheat fields along the Soviet frontier ripened under an uneasy sun, and every night new columns of German armor rolled closer to the border, their engines silent, their markings freshly painted. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact still stood. But soon the ink that had divided Europe would be replaced by blood that would drown it. June 21st, 1941. The border between Germany and the Soviet Union was quiet, eerily, impossibly quiet. From the forests near Brest-Litovsk to the fields of Ukraine, soldiers stood under a warm, windless sky, smoking, waiting, pretending nothing was coming. At 10:00 p.m., the Luftwaffe grounded its night patrols. At midnight, German radio stations switched to coded music, Beethoven's Eroica, the signal for go time. And at 3:15 a.m., the silence broke. Operation Barbarossa began. 3 million German soldiers, 3,500 tanks, 2,700 aircraft, 1,800 kilometers of front, the largest invasion in human history. The sky turned orange as artillery shells streaked across the border. The earth shook under tank treads. The first Soviet outposts were obliterated before they could send a single radio call. In the frontier town of Brest, a Soviet lieutenant named Alexander Morozov woke to the sound of the world ending. He ran to the fortress walls barefoot, still pulling on his jacket. The horizon was a wall of fire. Bombs fell in precise mechanical intervals, 10 seconds apart, each one closer than the last. Morozov grabbed a field phone, shouting into it, "Comrade Command, we're under attack! German—" Static. The line went dead. He looked up. German paratroopers were already descending from the smoke. The pact was over. In Moscow, Stalin slept until nearly 10 a.m. When his aide burst in with the news, the dictator blinked slowly, as if refusing to wake. "Hitler has attacked," the aide said. Stalin sat motionless. "Repeat that." German forces crossed the border at dawn. Kiev, Minsk, Smolensk, all under bombardment. He lit a cigarette with trembling fingers. "No," he muttered. "It's a provocation, not an invasion." Molotov entered moments later, pale and shaking. "It's no mistake, Joseph Vissarionovich," he said. "The Germans are bombing everywhere." Stalin stared out the window, smoke curling around his face. "So," he whispered, "the fool did it." That day, Berlin announced to the world, "At this hour, German troops are advancing against the Bolsheviks to destroy the Soviet threat forever." Goebbels called it Europe's holy war against communism. But to most Germans, it was simply the next step in a victory they believed inevitable. Inside the Soviet Union, confusion ruled. Commanders received no clear orders. Some units held their positions, others fled. In the skies over Minsk, Soviet pilots took off without ground control and died within minutes. By nightfall, German panzer divisions had already advanced 50 miles. The Red Army, leaderless, paralyzed, collapsed by the hour. At the Brest fortress, Lieutenant Morozov's unit still fought, surrounded. They'd been promised help from Moscow that never came. When ammunition ran out, they fought with bayonets. When bayonets broke, with stones. On the fortress wall, someone scrawled with a piece of coal, "We are dying, but we will not surrender." They never did. In the Kremlin that night, Stalin sat alone in his office. Reports piled up. Vilnius fallen, Minsk fallen, Brest fallen. His generals begged for directives. He gave none. For hours, he said nothing. Then, at last, he whispered, "Everything we built in 20 years, gone in one day." By the end of the first week, the Germans had captured 600,000 Soviet soldiers. Entire armies vanished without a trace. And as their tanks pushed deeper into the heart of Russia, one message reached Hitler's headquarters from his intelligence chief. The Soviet Union has collapsed. Victory will be complete before the first snow. But the first snow, history would prove, was already on its way. Late June 1941. The roads of the western USSR were choked with chaos. Columns of refugees, burning convoys, shattered tanks left like skeletons along the dirt. Every mile east smelled of diesel, blood, and disbelief. The Wehrmacht swept forward like an avalanche. In every direction, cities fell faster than Moscow could count them. By the 10th day, Hitler's forces had advanced 300 miles. Entire Soviet armies were surrounded before they even realized they'd been outflanked. German officers called it Kesselschlacht, the cauldron battle. Tens of thousands trapped, boiling in encirclement, until nothing moved. In a pine forest near Białystok, a Soviet captain named Yuri Antonov crawled through mud, blood pooling in his torn sleeve. Around him, the air stank of burning oil and flesh. He could hear German tanks moving nearby, slow, confident, hunting survivors. He pressed his face into the soil and whispered, "We're supposed to be the ones with numbers." A private beside him coughed weakly. "They said we'd stop them at the border." Antonov looked up. The border was gone. In Berlin, Hitler received maps covered in blue arrows driving toward Moscow. He paced before his generals, exultant. "Minsk in 7 days, Smolensk in 2 weeks, Moscow in a month." Halder, his army chief, tried to temper expectations. "The Soviets fight harder than expected." Hitler dismissed him with a grin. "They fight, yes, and then they die." He believed he had broken the last major army in Europe, but what he hadn't broken yet was its endurance. In the Kremlin, Stalin's silence finally cracked. On July 3rd, his voice, cold, uneven, exhausted, reached the nation over radio. "Comrades, brothers and sisters, a grave danger hangs over our country." The speech lasted just 11 minutes, but in those minutes, for the first time, Stalin called it what it was: the Great Patriotic War. He ended with a single promise: our cause is just. The enemy will be defeated. Victory will be ours. Across the country, millions listened. In basements, trenches, and rail stations, something old and fierce stirred again: survival. That same week, the first German columns reached the Dnieper. Villages burned. Prisoners marched west in endless lines, silent, skeletal shadows under the summer sun. In one convoy, a captured Polish officer recognized a pattern. The Germans who'd destroyed Poland were now devouring Russia. The pact that had once divided Europe had now turned on its creators. He whispered to another prisoner, "Maybe this is justice." The man beside him muttered, "There is no justice in war, only turns." By mid-July, the Wehrmacht had encircled Smolensk. German propaganda blared across Europe. Russia is finished. But in the forests beyond the city, small Soviet groups refused to die. Antonov, the captain from Białystok, had gathered 20 survivors. They hid among birch trees, ambushing convoys, cutting telephone lines, stealing food at night. One of his men asked, "Captain, when will Moscow send help?" Antonov looked at him. "They won't. We are the help." The first partisan unit was born. Back in Moscow, Stalin began relocating industries east of the Urals. Entire factories dismantled, loaded on trains, sent to Siberia. 1,000 miles away, engineers rebuilt them in fields under tarps, welding under snowfall. In less than 6 months, they'd produce more tanks than Germany ever imagined. But for now, all the Red Army had was desperation. By August, the German High Command sent a telegram to Hitler. "Our lines extend too far. Supplies dwindling, men exhausted." He wrote one word in the margin: advance. Outside Smolensk, the last Soviet divisions dug in and whispered the same promise as the Poles, the Finns, and the burned villages before them. "You will not pass here." But the panzers kept coming. August 1941. The fields of Ukraine burned like paper under a magnifying glass. Villages vanished overnight. Trains carrying soldiers east passed trains carrying civilians west, both full, both silent. In Berlin, maps showed victory spreading like wildfire. Smolensk captured, Kiev surrounded, Leningrad threatened. The German advance was a storm without pause. But every mile gained pulled the Wehrmacht deeper into a land that refused to end. Every sunrise brought a longer supply line, thinner rations, and colder nights. In Kiev, a German officer walked through the city square littered with rubble. A Soviet banner still hung from a lamppost, shredded but not gone. He turned to his sergeant. "Cut it down." The sergeant raised his rifle, then froze. From a nearby rooftop, a single shot cracked the air. The officer fell before the echo faded. By nightfall, the Germans burned 10 buildings in retaliation. The partisans were no longer rumors. They were everywhere, and invisible. In Moscow, Stalin moved his headquarters underground. His desk was bare except for a single map and an ashtray overflowing with cigarette stubs. Reports came in hourly. Kiev encircled, Odessa under siege, millions missing or dead. Molotov entered with fresh papers. "They've reached the Dnieper," he said. Stalin didn't look up. "And how long until they reach us?" Molotov hesitated. 6 weeks, perhaps less. Stalin lit another cigarette. "Then we make sure the 7th week never comes." He signed Order Number 270. "Soviet soldiers who surrender are traitors. Their families will be punished." Terror replaced retreat as discipline. Fear was now the army's fuel. The Luftwaffe bombed Moscow for the first time on July 21st. The city went dark. Citizens dug trenches in parks and squares. Anti-aircraft guns lined the rooftops of the Kremlin. That night, Stalin refused to leave. His aides begged him to move to Kuibyshev, far from the front. He shook his head. "If I leave, Moscow falls. If I stay, Moscow fights." From the roof of the Kremlin, he watched German planes drop fire over the city. The horizon glowed red, the same red that had once colored his maps of conquest. In the ruins of Kiev, Captain Yuri Antonov and his men still fought. They were out of ammunition, down to knives and stones. A young soldier looked at him and whispered, "Captain, we're surrounded." Antonov laughed, a sound half mad, half defiant. "Then we don't need to aim." When German tanks rolled into the city days later, Antonov's unit was gone. But graffiti scrawled across the walls read, "You may take the city, but not the night." By September, the Germans had captured nearly 2 million Soviet prisoners. The roads west were lined with columns of exhausted men, guarded by soldiers who were already starving. At Hitler's headquarters, the generals celebrated another victory. But one of them, General Heinz Guderian, spoke quietly. "Every step forward feels like a step into a grave." The room went silent. Hitler smiled tightly. "Then let the world be buried with us." In October, the German army launched Operation Typhoon, the final push for Moscow. The tanks advanced through rain, then mud, then snow. Engines froze. Horses died where they stood. For the first time, the Wehrmacht began to slow, and in that slowing, the Red Army found air to breathe. On November 7th, 1941, while German artillery thundered 60 miles from Moscow, Stalin stood atop Lenin's mausoleum. Snow fell on his coat as he spoke to the Red Army parade below. The enemy believes he stands at the gates of Moscow, but soon he will learn he stands at the gates of hell. As the tanks rolled past in formation, most of the men marching knew their destination wasn't a parade route. It was the front line. They'd march straight from Red Square into the fire. And for the first time since the pact that divided Europe, Stalin's war was no longer one of signatures. It was survival. December 1941. The German army was 18 miles from Moscow. Through the falling snow, they could see the faint glow of the city's lights, the heart of the Soviet Union, almost within reach. But the cold had turned against them. Engines froze solid overnight, rifles jammed, fuel turned to sludge in the lines, men wrapped newspapers around their boots and hands, but frostbite marched faster than any enemy. For every bullet fired, 10 soldiers froze. At dawn on December 5th, the Germans prepared for one final push. Then, from the forests north of Moscow, came the sound of horns. It wasn't German, it wasn't retreat, it was the Red Army, reborn. Thousands of fresh Soviet troops poured in from Siberia, faces hidden behind scarves, rifles gleaming with frost. They'd been waiting for this moment, ordered to stand ready until Japanese intelligence confirmed Japan would strike south, not east. Now Stalin unleashed them. The counter-offensive began. The first German line broke in 2 days. Soviet ski battalions swept across snowdrifts, flanking exhausted divisions. T-34 tanks, newly rolled from relocated factories, appeared from blizzards like ghosts of iron. For the first time, the Wehrmacht retreated, and Hitler refused to believe it. In his Wolf's Lair headquarters, he screamed at his generals, "Cowards! Every man who steps backward without orders will be shot." He dismissed his commanders one by one until only silence remained. In Moscow, Stalin emerged from the underground bunker for the first time in weeks. The city was still standing, barely, but alive. He walked through Red Square without bodyguards, snow crunching under his boots, the domes of St. Basil's faint under white haze. Civilians stopped, stared, then cheered softly, then louder, until the whole square thundered. Stalin didn't smile, but he lifted his hand once, just once, and nodded. It wasn't victory, not yet. But it was survival. Far to the west, in a frozen German trench, a corporal named Hans Adler, the same man who once questioned the pact 2 years ago, sat shivering under a torn blanket. He hadn't slept in days. The snow was red around him. His commander barked orders. "Hold the line! Moscow must fall!" Hans stared into the blizzard. "Moscow," he muttered, "isn't falling. We are." A shell landed nearby. The blast tore through the trench. When the smoke cleared, Hans was gone, buried under the snow, nameless among 1,000 others. By mid-December, the Soviet counterattack pushed the Germans back 100 miles. The invincible army that had conquered Europe was now broken, shivering, bleeding into the Russian winter. In Berlin, Goebbels broadcasted that the Eastern Front remains secure. But inside the Reich Chancellery, Hitler's hands shook. His dream of a 1,000-year empire had just met its first winter, and lost. In Moscow, Stalin met with Zhukov, his new general, calm, broad-shouldered, unflinching. Zhukov spread a map across the table, marking each point of retreat with red ink. "Comrade Stalin," he said, "we've stopped them." Stalin looked up. "No," he said quietly, "we've begun." As snow buried the corpses of 2 million men, the map of Europe had changed again, not by treaty, not by pact, but by survival. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the secret deal that once divided the continent, was dead, and the two powers that had built it were now locked in a war that would decide not who owned Europe, but whether Europe itself would survive. Winter, 1942. Snow buried the fields where armies had once stood, turning everything into a white ocean of silence. But beneath the stillness, Europe was beginning to shift again. The secret deal that had divided it now existed only in ashes and ghosts. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, once a line drawn across Poland, had become a front that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Every village, every frozen river, was now part of its consequence. At Hitler's headquarters, the generals stood over the map, Moscow had not fallen. The offensive had failed. 500,000 German soldiers were dead or missing. Hitler's voice trembled with rage. "It's the weather, the mud, the incompetence of my commanders." But deep down, the truth was simpler. The enemy had survived. He slammed his fist on the table. "We will try again. We'll crush them in the summer." The words echoed like prophecy, one that would lead them to Stalingrad. In Moscow, Stalin's winter victory hardened into resolve. He saw the same reports the Germans saw: frozen bodies, abandoned tanks, broken morale. But he also saw something else: momentum. Factories deep in the Urals roared to life again. Every hour, another T-34 rolled off the line. Every day, more soldiers arrived from the east, young and grim, carrying rifles that were still warm from the assembly floor. Zhukov presented new plans for spring. "Push them back from Leningrad, from Kharkov, from the Don," he said. Stalin nodded. "And then?" Zhukov hesitated. "Then we take back what we lost." Stalin looked at him sharply. "No, we take everything." Meanwhile, the NKVD unearthed new horrors in the territories retaken from the Germans. Mass graves near Smolensk, villages burned with everyone inside, and in a forest near Katyn, bodies of Polish officers executed with a single bullet to the skull. When Stalin received the report, he read it without expression. Molotov stood beside him, silent. After a moment, Stalin closed the file and said, "The Germans did this." Molotov nodded automatically. Of course. But in the room, no one truly believed it. The secret pact that had once united the two regimes had produced monsters on both sides, and Katyn was its truest child. In Berlin, the propaganda machine turned again. Goebbels broadcast endless speeches about defending Europe from Bolshevism. But inside Germany, whispers began to spread that something had changed, that this war, this victory promised in months, might never end. At night, mothers stood at windows, waiting for sons who would never return from Russia. Factories worked without pause, but letters from the front came slower, then stopped. The same silence that had once followed Stalin's purges now drifted over Germany. Spring thaw returned in 1942, revealing the bones of men buried where they fell. The rivers swelled with melted snow, carrying the debris of the dead. And still the armies prepared again, the Germans for a new offensive, the Soviets for survival. The world had turned twice since the pact was signed, and now both signatories were drowning in its consequences. Neither could undo it, neither could escape it. On June 28, 1942, German forces launched Operation Blue, their final push into the Soviet South. Hitler's new dream: the oil fields of the Caucasus, the city on the Volga, Stalingrad. Stalin watched the first reports in silence. When an aide asked, "Comrade, will they reach it?" he answered softly, "They will, and then we will bury them there." The next great chapter of the Pact's legacy had begun, and it would end in a city that bore Stalin's name, summer 1942. The sun returned to the Russian plains, hot and cruel, bleaching the wreckage of last winter's war. But the fighting never stopped. It simply changed direction. Germany's new offensive, Operation Blue, moved south like a firestorm. Hitler's goal: seize the oil fields of the Caucasus and cut the Soviet Union in half. His obsession: take Stalingrad, not because of strategy, because of pride, because of the name. Across the front, soldiers whispered, "We're going to Stalin's city." Some laughed, some cursed. None understood what that sentence would come to mean. By August, the Luftwaffe had turned the Volga into a furnace. Stalingrad burned for days, oil tanks, factories, whole neighborhoods collapsing into flame. Tens of thousands of civilians died in the first week, but the Soviets refused to evacuate. Stalin's order was clear: not one step back. Anyone who retreated without permission would be shot. The city became a battlefield of shadows. In the ruins of a tractor factory, Sergeant Yuri Antonov, once a captain, now simply a survivor, led his men through walls instead of streets. Every building was a fortress, every floor a new front. He whispered to his men, "We don't fight for land anymore. We fight for rooms. German snipers hunted from bell towers. Soviet sharpshooters replied from chimneys. Sometimes the distance between them was less than the length of a table. At night, the Volga glowed red from oil fires. Bodies floated silently downstream. In Moscow, Stalin read reports in silence. He circled Stalingrad on the map in red pencil. "This is where we hold," he said to Zhukov. Zhukov nodded. "It will cost everything." Stalin's eyes hardened. "Then, everything is what we'll spend." He ordered reinforcements from Siberia, from the Caucasus, from anywhere men could still stand. Factories doubled production again, even as workers slept between machines. The nation had become a weapon, and Stalingrad was the trigger. In Berlin, Hitler was euphoric. Reports claimed his Sixth Army had reached the Volga. He boasted to his generals, "Once Stalingrad falls, the Soviet Union collapses. The war is over." He didn't know his army was already trapped inside a coffin they'd built themselves. By October, the battle had swallowed the city whole. The Germans held 90% of it, but every inch bled them dry. Fuel was running low, ammunition too. The winter winds had started again, and beyond the ruins, beyond the smoking skyline, massive Soviet armies were gathering in silence. They were waiting for the perfect storm. November 19th, 1942. Before dawn, snow began to fall. Then came thunder, the kind made by 1,000 Soviet guns. Operation Uranus had begun. The Red Army struck not at the German corps, but at its flanks, where Romanian and Italian divisions guarded the perimeter. In 3 days, the encirclement was complete. The hunters had become the hunted. Inside Stalingrad, 300,000 German soldiers were surrounded, cut off, frozen. At Hitler's headquarters, silence fell when the news arrived. He refused to believe it. "Breakout is forbidden," he said. "The Sixth Army will stand and fight." He turned to his staff, trembling with rage. "They will fight to the last man." And they would. In the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, Sergeant Antonov lit a cigarette with shaking hands. Across the line, he could see German soldiers burning their last letters home. Snow fell over both sides, erasing the colors of uniforms. For the first time in years, the men who had been divided by a pact neither of them chose were now trapped together in the same graveyard. The secret deal that once carved Europe in half had come full circle, and the ghosts of 1939 were finally demanding payment. January 1943. The city of Stalingrad was a graveyard of iron and ash. The Volga was frozen solid. Beneath its ice lay men, horses, and the wreckage of entire divisions. The smoke had stopped rising, not because the battle was over, but because there was nothing left to burn. Inside the ruins, the Sixth Army of Germany was trapped. 300,000 men starving, freezing, dying one by one. Rats were food. Snow was water. Hope was treason. General Paulus, commander of the Sixth Army, sat in a bunker lit by a single candle. The radio crackled with orders from Berlin. "Hold your position. No surrender." He stared at the receiver for a long time, then whispered, "Hold what position? The snow?" Outside, Soviet loudspeakers echoed through the blizzard. "German soldiers, your generals have abandoned you. Lay down your arms. The war is lost for you. Save your lives." No one moved. They had nothing left to drop but their bodies. On January 10th, 1943, the Red Army launched Operation Ring, the final assault. Artillery fire thundered for 7 straight days. The explosions turned the snow black. By the end, the German defenses were gone, just shattered bunkers and hollow-eyed survivors. Paulus radioed Berlin again. "We are surrounded. No ammunition. The wounded are eating snow. What are your orders?" Hitler's reply came hours later. "You will stand or die. Capitulation is forbidden." Paulus stared at the message, then folded it once, neatly, and put it in his pocket. He didn't say a word. At dawn on January 31st, Soviet troops stormed the basement of the department store that served as German headquarters. They found Paulus sitting on a chair, motionless, his pistol on the table in front of him. He looked up at the soldiers and said quietly, "I am General Paulus. I surrender." It was the first time in Hitler's war that a German field marshal had surrendered alive. When the news reached Berlin, Hitler screamed he should have shot himself. A field marshal does not become a prisoner. But Stalingrad wasn't a battle anymore. It was judgment. In Moscow, Stalin received the report with a rare smile. He poured vodka for Zhukov and said, "The Volga has taken its payment." Zhukov raised his glass. "For the motherland." Stalin's eyes darkened. "For revenge." He knew the war was far from over, but now the tide had turned. The Red Army, once crushed and humiliated, was no longer fighting for survival. It was fighting to finish what began in 1939, to erase the line that divided Europe. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Hitler locked himself away. He ordered a national day of mourning, but forbade any mention of defeat. The papers called it a strategic withdrawal. Everyone knew it was a lie. Inside the ruins of his empire, he began preparing new orders, new offensives, new miracles, new suicides in waiting. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was gone, but its ghost still haunted both capitals, a reminder of how easily peace had once been sold, and how terribly the bill had come due. As spring thawed the snow in Stalingrad, Soviet soldiers began collecting helmets, rifles, bones, anything that could be buried. One of them, a young private, picked up a rusted German dog tag. He brushed the dirt away and whispered, "Who were you?" Then he dropped it into the mass grave with thousands of others. No one answered. The pact had silenced all names. That same week in the Kremlin, Stalin traced his finger across a new map. Poland, the Baltics, Belarus, Ukraine, all territories the pact had once divided. He turned to Beria and said, "We'll take them back, this time not as guests." And as his armies pushed west, the same lands once split by two signatures would soon be crushed by one. Spring 1943. The snow melted, revealing what was left of the war's first half. Burned tanks, broken helmets, and the bones of men from two empires that had once divided the world between them. The Germans called it der Rückzug, the retreat. The Soviets called it Osvobozdenie, the liberation. But liberation didn't look like victory yet. It looked like mud, blood, and silence. In Moscow, Stalin's map was changing colors. The red lines that had once been borders were now front lines. Each arrow westward was both revenge and reclamation. At a staff meeting, Zhukov laid out the next operation, Kursk. "The Germans will attack here," he said, pointing to a bulge in the front line that jutted west like a knife wound. "They want to cut it off." Stalin leaned forward. "And we?" Zhukov's voice was steady. "We let them come, and then we crush them." In Berlin, Hitler studied the same map. "Operation Citadel," he said, eyes burning. "The largest tank battle in history. One more blow, and the Red Army collapses." His generals warned him the troops were exhausted, the panzers worn down. He ignored them. "Kursk will be our vengeance for Stalingrad." But vengeance, like the pact that once bought him peace, was already a dead currency. July 5th, 1943. Before dawn, the sky over Kursk flashed white with artillery fire, thousands of Soviet guns firing first. The earth trembled. Birds vanished from the sky. When the German tanks rolled forward, they met minefields so thick they detonated like storms. Panthers and tigers advanced into flames and smoke so dense they couldn't see 10 meters ahead. The air was filled with the scream of dive bombers, the grind of metal, the roar of engines dying in mud. And from the forests came the Red Army, dug in, waiting, unbroken. Sergeant Yuri Antonov, scarred, older now, crouched beside his T-34, the engine rumbling behind him. He'd fought since the first day of the invasion. He'd buried more friends than he could remember. He watched a German Tiger tank crest the ridge, its cannon swinging toward him. "Now," he whispered. His gunner fired. The shell hit the Tiger's flank, and the beast erupted in a tower of fire. Antonov exhaled, smoke filling his lungs. That one was for Warsaw. By July 13th, the Battle of Kursk was over. The Germans retreated again, this time for good. They would never regain the initiative. Hitler refused to accept it. He blamed the weather, the fuel, his generals. But deep down he knew His war was shrinking. Stalin, however, saw the opposite. He stood over a new map marked in crimson. "From here," he said to Zhukov, "we drive to Berlin." Zhukov nodded once, but he knew what that meant. It wasn't just the end of Hitler. It was the end of Europe as it had been. In the West, Allied forces had landed in Italy. Britain and America were finally pressing Germany from the other side. Two wars, one promise: crush the Reich. For the first time since 1939, the world that Hitler and Stalin had secretly carved in half was closing in on itself. And somewhere under all that history, Poland, divided, occupied, erased, was waiting in the dark, wondering which empire would own it next. By late 1943, the Soviets recaptured Kiev. Stalin stood before the press and declared, "We have liberated the motherland." But behind closed doors, his orders were different. Keep advancing. Do not stop at our borders. The line that had once split Europe in ink was about to be redrawn in blood, and this time there would be no one left to sign it. Winter 1944. The Red Army had crossed back into Poland, the land where it had all begun. 5 years earlier, it had marched in as a liberator. Now it returned as an executioner. The fields were littered with snow and memory. The same villages that had watched Soviet tanks roll in under Stalin's pact now watched them return under a different flag, a different story, the same silence. In Lublin, Soviet troops discovered the remains of a German concentration camp, Majdanek, barbed wire, gas chambers, piles of shoes taller than men. It was the first of the camps to be liberated, and even the soldiers who had seen everything stopped walking when they entered. A Soviet journalist wrote that night, "We thought we knew what war was. We did not." The photographs went to Moscow within hours. Stalin ordered them published. For the first time, he called it what it was: genocide. But in private, he saw something else in those images. Something useful. Proof. A weapon. A story he could wield when the war was over and Europe had to be divided again. In Berlin, Hitler raged at the news. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Army Group Center, 500,000 men, had been annihilated. The Red Army advanced 400 miles in 2 months. "Cowards!" he screamed at his generals. "You've betrayed me." He didn't realize the betrayal had happened years earlier, in a marble room in Moscow, when he'd mistaken Stalin's handshake for trust. At the front, Soviet columns thundered west through Belarus and Ukraine. Yuri Antonov rode atop his tank, goggles caked with frost, wind slicing his face. He'd fought through Smolensk, Kursk, Kiev. Now the signs by the roadside were in Polish again. When he passed the border marker, he stopped and touched it. The paint was faded, the eagle emblem chipped. He whispered, "You're free again," though he didn't know if it was true. In Warsaw, news spread like electricity. The Soviets are coming. The underground Polish Home Army, the AK, rose in revolt against the Germans. They seized weapons, raised flags, took buildings. The city fought street by street for freedom before the Red Army arrived. But the Red Army never arrived. Stalin halted his advance across the Vistula. For 2 months, he watched through binoculars as the Germans crushed the Warsaw uprising. 200,000 Poles died. The city was reduced to dust. When an aide asked why he didn't intervene, Stalin replied coldly, "Why help enemies who will govern against us?" For him, Poland wasn't a country to save. It was a border to reclaim. By January 1945, Soviet forces were unstoppable. They swept through East Prussia, through Silesia, through every village that once flew a swastika. The German people fled in columns, civilians, old men, children, frozen in the snow. Antonov watched them pass, hollow-eyed, some carrying photographs of sons killed on his side of the line. He didn't hate them anymore. He was too tired for hate. He only said, "This is what the pact made of all of us." In Berlin, Goebbels broadcast one final delusion. "The Bolsheviks will never take our capital. We will fight to the last bullet." But even he knew it was over. The empire that began with a handshake in 1939 now waited for its execution. March 1945. The Red Army reached the Oder River. Moscow ordered one final push. Stalin stood before his generals, hand trembling slightly over the map. "Berlin," he said. "End it." and in his eyes burned the same thing that once burned in Hitler's. A vision of Europe remade in his image. The pact that divided the continent had ended, but the shadow it cast was only beginning. April 1945. Berlin was a skeleton of stone and smoke. The city that once roared with parades now whispered through broken glass. Every street was a trench, every building a tomb. From the east came the thunder, Soviet artillery pounding day and night. The sky over the capital was red without flame, trembling without rest. The Red Army had reached the heart of the empire. Marshal Zhukov stood beside a map spread over the hood of a T-34 tank. Mud spattered his boots, dust coated his medals. He turned to his men. "This is the last push," he said. "No more borders, no more retreats." The soldiers nodded, faces gray from exhaustion and disbelief. Many had fought from Stalingrad to this moment. 3 years of killing just to arrive here where it had all started. They didn't cheer, they simply advanced. In the ruins beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler still clung to delusion. His hands shook as he marked phantom divisions on a map. He muttered to Goebbels, "The Russians will stop. They'll turn on the Americans. They must." But the only thing turning now was time. The deal that had once given him half of Europe had come back like a debt collector. He'd fed the beast in Moscow, and now the beast was here. April 25th. On the banks of the Elbe River, Soviet and American troops met at Torgau. For the first time, two halves of the war touched hands. Photographs captured the moment. Smiles, cigarettes, flags waving in a broken city. But beneath the celebration, there was unease. Each side looked at the other and wondered who would hold the peace. The war was ending, but the world was already splitting again. In Poland, Yuri Antonov's tank brigade crossed into Germany proper. He saw fields full of refugees, Germans fleeing their own armies, Poles searching for homes that no longer existed, Jews crawling out of camps that weren't supposed to have survivors. He stopped by a road sign riddled with bullets. Berlin, 80 kilometers. His gunner asked, "When it's over, what happens to us?" Antonov didn't answer. He didn't know. April 30th. Deep beneath Berlin, Hitler shot himself. His empire ended with a gunshot no louder than a whisper. When Soviet soldiers entered the bunker, they found the smell of burnt paper and gasoline. The man who once divided Europe was now a handful of ash. That same night, Stalin received the report. He nodded once, expression unreadable. "Good," he said. "Now the real work begins." The room was silent, because everyone knew what work meant. May 8th, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. Church bells rang from London to Moscow. Men wept in streets. Women hugged strangers. The world called it Victory Day. But in the ashes of Warsaw, in the ruins of Berlin, victory looked like rubble and graves. The pact that once promised peace had ended in fire, and the peace that followed would carry its scars. As the Red Army raised its flag over the Reichstag, Antonov stood in the courtyard below, covered in soot and blood. He looked up at the hammer and sickle waving in the wind. Around him, soldiers cheered, fired rifles, sang songs. He didn't. He just whispered, "We've come full circle." He remembered the map of 1939, the thick black line dividing Poland, and he realized they had erased it, not with ink, with lives. In the Kremlin, as victory celebrations thundered across Red Square, Stalin sat alone in his office. Molotov entered quietly. "Europe is ours," he said. Stalin looked at the map, Eastern Europe shaded in red once more. He traced the same line he had drawn 6 years ago, this time pushing it farther west, all the way to Berlin. Then he said softly, "Not divided this time, Vyacheslav. Occupied." The secret deal that began the war had ended in conquest, and from its ashes a new line was about to be drawn. A colder one, invisible, uncrossable. The line they would call the Iron Curtain. Summer 1945. The guns had gone silent, but Europe still shook. The war that began with a handshake between dictators had ended with cities turned to dust and millions unburied. The Allies met in the ruins of Germany to decide what would come next. Potsdam, Yalta, Tehran. Names that would replace the old ones, Warsaw, Berlin, Moscow, as the vocabulary of a new kind of war. At the Potsdam Conference, the world sat at one table but on opposite sides. Truman, Churchill, and Stalin, the victors, discussed peace as if dividing the spoils of a corpse. Maps unfolded again, lines were drawn again, borders redrawn by hands that had already killed too many to shake clean. Stalin wanted Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, the Baltics. Security, he said. After all we've suffered, we need a buffer. Churchill stared across the table. A buffer, Marshal? Or a wall? Stalin smiled. One man's wall is another's safety. The room went cold. Outside, the Red Army occupied half the continent. Cities were liberated, then locked behind Soviet administrations. Elections were promised, then postponed, then replaced. In Warsaw, the few survivors of the Home Army returned from hiding, hoping to rebuild, only to be arrested by the NKVD. In Prague, statues of Stalin rose before the rubble had even cooled. In Berlin, Soviet officers replaced Nazis in the offices of command. The pact that once divided Europe had not truly died. It had simply changed uniforms. Yuri Antonov remained with his unit in Poland, now called an occupation force. He walked through Warsaw's ruins and saw children playing among bricks where churches used to stand. A local man approached him and said, "We waited for the Soviets to save us." Antonov nodded, unsure what to say. The man's voice broke. "You came too late." That night, Antonov sat in his tank and stared at the stars. He whispered, "Maybe everyone came too late." In Moscow, Stalin was hailed as the savior of Europe. Posters showed him with open arms, peace doves, smiling workers. But behind the parades, trains full of Polish, Lithuanian, and Ukrainian prisoners rolled east again. Old habits, reborn in victory. Molotov entered Stalin's office one evening, holding a new folder. Treaties, control zones, reparations. "All agreed upon," he said. Stalin nodded, pouring vodka. "To peace," Molotov offered. Stalin raised his glass. "To permanence." They drank. And somewhere in the night, another border crossed another dream. In London, Churchill gave a speech that would name the next war before it began. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. The phrase cut through history like a knife. It was the truth everyone already felt. The world was splitting again. Not by invasion, by ideology. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had once been a secret. Now its ghost had become policy. In Berlin, a young soldier asked Antonov, "Comrade, are we going home now?" Antonov looked west, where American patrols stood across the river. He shook his head. "This is home now." He didn't know whether it was pride or despair. In the Kremlin, Stalin stood alone before his great map once more. The war was over. The world was divided again. Only this time, the ink was permanent. He traced the red half of Europe with one finger and whispered, "We did not start this war, but we will decide how it ends." Outside, Moscow's bells rang for peace, but for millions caught behind those new red borders, peace would last as long as fear allowed. The pact had ended in fire, but its shadow would linger for generations, the first scar of a Cold War that had already begun.